that information, or do they want that information? Because I remember in the 80s hearing, soon we're going to have genomes, and you could know if you're going to get Huntington's.
Yeah.
This, very destructive degenerative disorder. And then people said, well, I wouldn't want to know. I think many people would also want to know. And especially parents, if they can just get past their guilt that it has something to do with them, I think they'd want to help their kids avoid these predispositions, given that most of what we're talking about are maladaptive predispositions.
So this is a complicated and really rapidly growing area of research, which is what happens if you return people's genetic information back to them. So if you have ever done 23andMe or some sort of direct-to-consumer genetics company, you might have gotten this is your genetic risk for Crohn's disease, or this is your genetic risk for Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And now there are more companies that are expanding into that genetic information around many gene indices. We call them polygenic indices or polygenic scores that are correlated with someone's risk for developing an alcohol use disorder, say. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. One is that our genetic information is rapidly improving. It's still not very good at the level of predicting an outcome for an individual. So, as an example, you can think cities that are at higher altitude tend to be colder. That's a correlation. That's a correlation of around 0.4, 0.5. You can know that if you're trying to think about, which cities are colder on average than others. That's not going to tell you, do you need to pack a sweater if you're going to Montreal next Tuesday, right? That's a specific weather incident. Polygenic scores right now are I can tell you that, in general, these people have a higher risk than these people, but they're not a pregnancy test or even a Huntington's disease test. They're not prognosticators of an individual person's risk for an alcohol use disorder. There's some uncertainty there. The other question is, what are the ethics of telling someone that they have a low genetic risk, especially if we're uncertain about that? You've talked a lot about how, no alcohol on average is better for you than some alcohol. We think about the risks of telling someone that they're genetically predisposed towards a negative life outcome, but there's also risk to telling someone that they're not genetically predisposed, because are they going to interpret that as license to drink more? I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to worry about my consumption because this company told me that I'm at low risk. And then the other thing you're picking up on is that there are individual differences in desire for kind of deliberate ignorance. So there's a great study after the wall came down in Berlin that was conducted on whether or not people want to know the contents of their Stasi files, who was reporting on them. And some people were like, of course I want to know. Of course I want to know who was saying what about me. And other people were saying, no, I don't. Deliberate ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. Deliberate ignorance is what I want.
This is what other people were saying about them.
Yes.
Don't read the comments.
Yeah. Deliberate ignorance. Don't read the comments is also a form of deliberate ignorance.
This is like an avid debate between podcasters. Rogan is Mr. Don't read the comments. Lex Friedman and I go back and forth on this.
On reading the comments.
It can be useful.
So all of that to say, I think we're in a situation in which the science is rapidly developing. It's not nearly at a point where it's going to be a high confidence predictor. There's also risks to being told that you have a low genetic risk, because it might act as a permission structure for behavior that might ultimately prove to be risky. And also, people's psychologies are complicated, and not everyone responds to more information as a good thing. Not everyone wants to read the comments of their DNA.
This isn't a pushback, but I feel like most people, even if they don't understand genes and heritability, understand that they got their genes from their parents.
Yeah.
So there is an argument to be made, perhaps, that people are already doing this. Someone whose father was an alcoholic, whose grandfather was an alcoholic, could say, well, I got to be really careful because obviously this runs in my family, right? And then someone say, well, your mom doesn't have an issue with alcohol. She could have a couple of drinks, no big deal. So you're protected. And we don't know how gene dosing protects us or makes us vulnerable. No one knows, but we all do this, right?
I think we do.
We'll get into discussions about genes and heritability, but the topic of eugenics and genetic selection even within embryos is super dicey nowadays. Everyone's, it's so scary to even have the discussion. But then I've always said, people do a ton of genetic selection.
Donors.
They pick sperm donors and they pick partners.
Yes.
oftentimes based on a combination of traits, which are clearly involve genes. So people are doing a genetic selection in partner choice anyway. And so to me, maybe it's just the scientist in me, the conversation feels unnecessarily scary. But when it comes to things like substance use disorder, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. I think it makes sense to look at your parents and say, listen, if one of them has an issue with alcohol, or both of them have an issue with alcohol, I have to be very careful with alcohol.
And with your children too, right? I think as parents, at least as a mother, I look at my kids and I think they don't have the same temperament. They don't have the same personality. I think the risks of cannabis use is different for my son and for my daughter. And so I think an attuned parent is going to be thinking about, what do I know about my kid as they go into adolescence? How does that inform how I'm helping shape their environment? I think what you're picking up here is that oftentimes people treat genetic information as if it exists in a vacuum and it's the only thing we know about a person. And that's obviously not true. There are phenotypes that we see in our family members and our prospective mates and our children. And most of the research can also act as if you would be returning genetic information about a child or about a person to that person, and it's the only thing that they know. And that's not true. So I think that we really are at a place where we need more meta-science, science about the science, in what is the most responsible way to give people access to their genetic information in a way that permits them to make the best choices. But we're not going to be able to do that if we're continuing to pretend that genetic information exists somehow siloed from all the other things that people are paying attention to when they're observing themselves and their family members.
If you're a regular listener of the Huberman Lab podcast, you've no doubt heard me talk about the vitamin mineral probiotic drink AG1. And if you've been on the fence about it, now's an awesome time to give it a try. For the next few weeks, AG1 is giving away a full supplement package with your first subscription to AG1. They're giving away a free bottle of vitamin D3K2, a bottle of omega-3 fish oil capsules, and a sample pack of the new sleep formula AGZ, which, by the way, is now the only sleep supplement I take. It's fantastic. My sleep on AGZ is out of this world good. AGZ is a drink, so it eliminates the need to take a lot of pills. It tastes great. And like I said, it has me sleeping incredibly well, waking up more refreshed than ever. I absolutely love it. Again, this is a limited time offer, so make sure to go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to get started today. I feel like the more information we have about our parents and their parents and their positive traits and their, let's just call them maladaptive, destructive traits to themselves or to others, the more informed our choices can be. But I do understand that it can start to set up some constraints in our mind of what we are capable of or not capable of.
Yeah.
But I also feel like, especially in the United States, there's this notion that we can become anything. It wasn't until I was in a relationship with somebody from Southern Europe that I realized that notion growing up with that is kind of outrageous to some people in the world. Because in a lot of areas of the world, as you know, people get siloed really early on. And not everyone grows up thinking they could be an amazing athlete if they chose that path.
Yeah.
They could be a billionaire if they chose that path. They could. But in the United States, we love this notion of anyone can get to any position if they just work hard enough and believe in themselves and align with the right people.
So I think that you think of it probably as, another source of data, and isn't more data better? Like, isn't we improve our decision-making when we have more variables at hand? That's a very scientific way to think about genetic information. Whereas I think for many people in the broader public, there can be a temptation to see genes as a very special sort of information. Genetic has a myth around it that maybe this is my data on my heart rate variability doesn't have about it. Often I think that people can fall into these really essentialist stories about genetics, that it's telling them something about their deepest or truest selves. And that's when the delivery of genetic information, without correcting their perception of what genes are really telling us, can start to be dangerous. I mean, I think about 23andMe. Their tagline for many years was, "Welcome to you. Spit in this tube, welcome to you," right? That we are not just going to give you another piece of information about yourself to add to all of the things that you could be using. We are going to tell you who you really are. And it's when the genetic information lapses into these more essentialist stories that I think things get to be, in your words, a little bit thornier, a little bit riskier.
I never did 23andMe, but they were just right up the road, but somehow never did it. But I did hear that one of the surprising results of 23andMe and companies like it was that a not insignificant number of people discovered they have relatives that they didn't know they had.
Yes, or that their father isn't the father that they thought they had.
Which is a pretty major psychological frame shift.
Yeah. I gave a talk at a college, a small college, and it was a writing class. And they had to write about a book. And they chose my book to write about, which is great. It's like, freshmen, and they all have to actually write something. And they chose a book that was deliberately, a little bit controversial to give them something to push off on. And I asked him, I said, why, you're a writing professor. How did you find my book? And he said, well, I did 23andMe. And I realized that the man who raised me is not my biological father. My parents didn't know this. It was our fertility doctor who was my biological father. And I have something like 26 half siblings because this guy had been doing it in his practice for years. The doctor is now deceased. And I just was like, that's so much more interesting than I'm going to talk about, like anything I'm going to talk about with these freshmen, this story. And that, and I think that speaks to, he had a whole narrative about his life and his family. And then he got this piece of genetic information and it blew that story out of the water because there was something about the genetic lineage that is really important to our sense of who we are. And he really had to reconstruct, his family story and his identity in the light of that information.
It's so interesting because I've heard of people learning something unfortunate, bad about their grandparent or parent that they weren't aware of, and then internalizing that somehow they are bad. Mm-hmm. Especially young kids can internalize that message.
Yeah.
This is a message to all people who may end up divorced. Don't badmouth the other parent because you're essentially telling your kids that they come from bad. There's badness in them.
Yeah.
And we all think that this is about people's behavior, but my understanding of, spent a little bit of time with this literature, just how people interpret information and how kids interpret information is that they're like, oh, I come from something bad. And there's actually, there's all these movies about this. Star Wars has this, and and other movies. Like our genetic origins and how those played out in previous generations can frighten people about themselves.
Yes. So to go back to your earlier question about how do we talk about genetics in relation to these phenotypes that are really part of our identities. Another thing is that I don't think anyone's bad. I don't think anyone's all good either. I think that humans are complicated and our behaviors are complicated, and none of us can be reduced to one thing we've done or one gene we have or one aspect of our phenotype. But that is a really common perception that genetics is telling us something essential about ourselves, and that it might turn out that essential thing is a bad thing. I write in my new book about this letter that I got from a man who is in prison. He's been in prison since he was 16 for a horrific crime that he committed. It's actually a violent crime that he committed when he was 15 years old. So still an adolescent, still a growing brain, still not an adult. In Texas, you can be tried an adult as 15, and he's been in prison ever since then. And he read about my lab, our behavior genetics lab at Texas, and an issue of Texas Monthly magazine, which I guess the prison subscribes to. And he wrote me a letter, and it showed up in my university mailbox. And it was him saying, I've done this thing. Like, let me tell you about myself. I've been in prison my whole adult life, even before then. What do you think makes a child go bad, nature or nurture? And that question haunted me because I could give him a technical answer, which is I could say, we know that nature matters. We know that nurture matters. We know that all of our behaviors are influenced by both nature and nurture. But I think when he's writing me, he's not just asking for a science lesson, right? He's someone who's done something horrible. And he's saying, I feel like I'm inherently a horrible person. And that might be because of my genetics. Did my genetics make me bad? And I think that's a story about genetics, which has no scientific basis, but really pops up in a lot of places in our culture. And it makes it very difficult to talk about because, you're here saying these genetic variants are expressed at this point in prenatal development, and that increases your probability of these having these behaviors. But if someone hears that as I could be born bad or I could be born broken, That's absolutely not what we're saying. But that story about genetics is really, woven through our culture.
The bad seed.
The bad seed, bad to the bone, natural born killer. I think the fact that we can come up with English idioms and phrases for this so easily tells us something about the way that we think about behavior, morality, the self, and biology.
I have so many questions, but I think the first one I want to ask is a developmental one.
Yeah.
I think most of us, presumably, carry this idea that it's during puberty and the activation of hormones, in particular testosterone, that takes a sweet kid and makes them a bad kid. I think that's not true. I don't believe that's true. But are there examples of, in the literature, of kids prior to puberty being destructive in a sociopathic way?
Yes. And that's one of the biggest predictors of what people have called a life course persistent pattern of antisocial offending, which is onset before the age of 10. Antisocial behavior that's not just destruction of property, but also aggression against other children. And when we're thinking about aggression, oftentimes we discriminate between aggression when provoked versus proactive, kind of cold aggression. So the worst prognosis we would anticipate would be a male child who begins to aggress against other children or against animals before the age of 10 and doesn't feel guilt or remorse around that has kind of this cold callousness about it. That's a poor prognosticator of having well-regulated behavior into adulthood. So of those kids who have conduct disorder, especially before the age of 10 with these callous emotional features, we would expect that 50 to 75% of them will have a substance use disorder in adulthood. A non-trivial percentage will meet criteria for antisocial personality or another personality disorder in adulthood. And so again, I think we're looking at a subset of children where there's clearly a heavy genetic component. There's clearly a heavy nurture component. It's very neurodevelopmental in terms of its origins and early brain development. And currently we have vanishingly few effective treatments. And again, I think that's because people have maybe implicitly or unconsciously interpreted the genetic research or the biological research as these kids were born bad, not these kids were born with a set of neurodevelopmental liabilities, and we really need to figure out how to help them. What are the treatments we can offer them? And when people see something as a moral failing, they're less likely to see it as a biomedical problem that we can, throw the weight of science behind.
What percentage of these kids younger than 10 that show this antisocial behavior are male versus female?
The sex ratio varies, but sometimes it's 2 to 1, sometimes it's as high as 4 to 1. So
and that can't be explained by post-utero testosterone because they haven't hit puberty yet.
Yeah.
So it either is an early organizing effect in utero, or there's something on the Y chromosome that creates a susceptibility.
And we really don't know. Actually, one of my former postdocs is working on this now, the analysis of the X chromosome, because most genetic studies just focus on the autosome, so just focused on the non-sex chromosomes. The other thing is we also see this in animals, that male guinea pigs are much more vulnerable to the effects of preterm birth than female guinea pigs. Again, preterm birth disrupts that same kind of GABA to glutamate excitatory inhibitory balance that we're also seeing popping up in the genetic research. Also, I have 3 kids. I have 2 girls and 1 boy. And even with humans, the labor and delivery nurse will be like, okay, well, we got to keep him in longer because those early boys, they struggle. They know that the male fetus seems to be more vulnerable to these insults than the female fetus.
Are the guinea pigs sociopathic?
Guinea pigs, all of these things you used to work with non-human animal models.
For better or worse, I've worked with so many different species. I have to say, I do not miss working with animals for a variety of reasons.
That's how I ended up in a clinical psych program.
Humans can consent to be in an experiment.
Yeah.
As an animal lover, it eventually wore on my soul too much. Yeah. And I understand where it's necessary. I also think there's an excess in particular, and I'll lose some friends with this, but in particular, some of the larger primate work, one really needs to justify. And there are instances where there's good justification, but I've worked with a lot of different animals. But I was about to say, I know we both dog lovers, there's this saying, there are no bad dogs, just bad owners. Mm-hmm. But we don't say that about humans. We don't say, oh, they're no bad people. Everyone is a good person. They're just bad parents. At some point, usually 18, we say you're responsible for your actions, regardless of what happened to you, regardless of the genes you came into this world with. And things shift where people understandably are responsible for their behavior in a different way. Sounds like in Texas, it can come in earlier, depending on the crime.
Yeah.
But I assume all dogs are good dogs, that they're trustworthy, that they would never harm you or another dog, maybe an animal, because I've seen what happens when certain dogs get a hold of certain animals. But I don't think we make the same assumption about people.
I don't think we do either. I titled my new book, Original Sin, to really spotlight this exact thing. Before I was a scientist, the first 20 years of my life, I was an evangelical Christian. So I was raised in a very fundamentalist household, Southern, praised God and passed the ammunition in lots of ways. And in my brand of Christianity that I was raised in, which was Protestant, Reformed, Calvinist, I really was raised with this idea of original sin, which is that humans are born bad, that they're born depraved, that they're born broken. And I don't believe that's true, but that's the explicit teaching of some religious traditions. And that's a religious tradition that was really foundational to our culture and our institutions. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we talk about how there's no bad dogs, but we assume people can be inherently bad. Because I think many of us were taught that, from a young age, that all of us, or some of us, if you're thinking about Calvinist theology of some people are the elect and some people are that some of us are inherently bad. So you can be raised with a religious tradition that really is talking about inherent depravity. And then you have a scientific tradition that's studying, well, how do genes affect bad things that people do? And then we have debates about how science should be used. And that's where I think things get really thorny and really tricky, which is how do we apply the science without lapsing into this really ancient way of thinking, which is interpreting the science as proof that we're broken, that people are broken. At the same time, going back to this letter that I received, people do horrible shit. Like people do horrible things to each other. And I think about that man who wrote me a letter and I can say, I think he did a horrible thing. And I think he probably, everything I know scientifically, I think he probably had horrible luck in terms of his parents and his genes and his birth experiences and his child experiences. And so how do we put those together? What does it mean to hold someone responsible for how they behave? I do think that we're responsible for ourselves and responsible to each other, while also keeping in mind the fact that no one created themselves from scratch. By the time he was an adult, he was already in prison for the things that had happened to him while he was still technically a child. I wrote this book, my new book, because I was really attempting to wrestle through that question.
I think I'm getting this story right. It's a true story that was told by our former director of neurosciences at Stanford, Bill Newsom, about the guy who went up in the tower at UT Austin and shot a bunch of people.
The tower
killed
shooter.
them. The tower shooter. I think he was eventually taken out by a security guard. The remarkable thing about the story is, at least the way I remember it, is that this guy knew something was wrong with him, thought that the site of the problem was in his brain, was asking people to look at his brain and help him. I think I'm getting this right. Yes. We'll double check. And then said, at the point where he realized he was going to go through with this thing, with this act, that he wanted them to look at his brain. And it turned out he had a tumor in I think it was some temporal lobe region that...
It was amygdala.
It was actually in the amygdala. So you know the story clearly. And it's where you work.
Yes.
Fortunately, occurred long before you work. Terrible that it happened at all. But in this age of school shooters and public massacres, right? People just, going up into the Vegas hotel window and, hosing people with bullets. This case is a unique one because the guy knew there was something wrong with him, in some sense, wanted help, but you can kind of create this picture of, angel devil conversations in his head between neural circuitry that's saying, don't do this, ask for help and do this. And I mean, it's like the cartoon or movie with the angel and the devil on the shoulder or in each ear. What are we to make of that?
Yeah. Gosh, the Whitman case is so interesting because he did say that there was something wrong with him. He did ask for help. After he died, the state of Texas ordered an autopsy, and they found that they had this tumor, and the whole thing was basically labeled like almost like a natural disaster had occurred. So the report talks about like the catastrophe or this incident that happened. So they ultimately, when trying to make sense of Whitman's shooting people from the tower at Texas, took what some philosophers have called this objective view. So basically, like they weren't viewing him as an agent who's doing something in the realm of good or bad, a moral failing. They're viewing him as kind of a machine that's gone haywire, right? He got a tumor in his amygdala and he wouldn't have done it if he hadn't had this tumor. How would they have made sense of his behavior if he hadn't asked for a brain autopsy? If they didn't know about this tumor, how many other people have something going on with them in a specific location that, if we knew about it, might help us understand how this behavior came across? I write in my book the story of this Dutch family where basically all the women in the family were functioning okay, but half the men in the family were, one raped his sister, one stabbed his boss with a pitchfork, one committed arson, multiple of the men were in prison. And at some point, I guess one of the women was like, y'all, you have to figure out what's going on with the men in our family. Like, this is too much to be a coincidence. And what they found is that on the X chromosome, they had inherited a rare mutation in the MAOA gene. So MAOA is an enzyme that degrades monoamines that, regulate how your neurons are talking to one another. And women have 2 X chromosomes. So if they inherit a bad version, there's still the other version, whereas men only have 1 X. And so from their mom, they got a 50-50 shot. Am I going to get the mutated version or the non-mutated version? I mean, I find this study fascinating on so many levels, right? That the single letter change in your DNA could have this massive effect on your behavior. But also that all of these men were in the criminal justice system and had not been obviously flagged as something organic or biological or mental illness going on with them. And later, there was another group that found this ostensibly rare mutation in several other impulsively aggressive boys that had been referred to their hospital. And they ended their scientific paper on what I find one of the most haunting notes in the scientific literature, which is this actually rare? Or is it that when we're faced with people doing horrible things, we never even stop to look for what might be causing it from a genetic or neurobiological, from organic way, which I think that's a really, really chilling thought. So how do we, in the absence, I think the question that you're asking is an important one, which is in the absence of some smoking gun, the mutated gene, the amygdala tumor, how do we put together our knowledge as scientists, as people who read the science, that yes, it's genes, yes, it's environment, yes, it goes into the behavior. And also, we're humans, we have this outrage and this blame towards people that harm each other. How do we as humans hold both of those truths at the same time? I think that's the real challenge.
I think once somebody is harmed, our empathy shifts to the victim.
Yes.
Or victims.
Yes.
In a way that occludes our, maybe even at times, depending how close we are to the victims or how much we identify with it, that occludes our even care. That like, okay, this guy went up on this, I'm describing it historically, this guy went up on this tower, killed 2, the security guard eventually got him, but the parent of that kid that was just walking to class, or, the young woman who was, freshman year or whatever, she's dead now. Yeah. She's gone. Yes. And so I think that in a kind of healthy way, in a healthy way, we think the hell with that guy. One less, glad they killed him. People will say that, right? People will say that. I'm not necessarily yeah, I guess in some sense, if I just stand back and my reflexive response is like, this guy killed a lot of people. I understand he was driven to it. He was stricken with something. And but it's hard for me to get to, okay, well, there's a genetic thing that set him up from a glioma in the amygdala of all places. Like he bad luck. But because we assume that people can intervene in their own behavior. This gets down to kind of free will type stuff that my colleague, Robert Sapolsky, he'll argue to the end of time that there's no free will, which is a frustrating one for many of us. But, he's a hell of a smart guy. I think that the issue for many people is that genes are fairly far upstream from behavior.
Yes.
If I said, okay, there's this guy down in, Los Angeles and, he got rabies from a dog he was trying to save from the LA River. And then 3 days later, he randomly committed this crime. He killed somebody. You say, well, he had rabies. He was rabid. Like we can make the connection very easily, but that's a neural virus that hits the amygdala, among other things, and causes people to get very aggressive. We'd go, okay,
Well, you can imagine him without the rabies. So there's some distance between the self that is the object of moral judgment and the cause that you're locating as the salient cause for this behavior. And if there's daylight between those, then you can say, okay, well, I can imagine what he was like before the rabies. Genes make it harder to do that because when we think of them as so essential to the making of the self that is the object of moral judgment, who is the person that has different genetics, right? We can imagine what Whitman would have been like if he didn't have the tumor. We could imagine what the guy would be like if he didn't get with rabies. But who is the person who has a different genotype? It's very difficult to cast a different self. And so it's very difficult to rescue that self from our condemnation.
I'll say something controversial on the back of what you just said, which is there may even be, I'm speculating here, you're the geneticist, there may even be some deeply hardwired, unconscious notion around genes that we know that genes can be inherited, that if somebody has a gene which makes them a quote unquote bad seed or predisposes them to a really bad behavior and then they engage in it and then they're in jail for the rest of their life or they get shot by the security guard, we hear the words good riddance. Good riddance implies good. Those genes were now stopped.
Yeah.
We don't know if they reproduced before that. So there's something which makes the example you gave before, especially eerie, of the IVF doc that was literally seeding these eggs with his own genes. And then somebody is like, the implication is not that that person was killing themselves, but whoever that physician was, not somebody, it's terribly unethical at every level.
And he's replicating.
He's replicating his bad genes, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody who has a genetic predisposition to be sociopathic or really destructive is eliminated, for lack of a better word, or taken out of society, sure, I can, orient to the empathy around this person who feels stricken, but I think I believe we are more hardwired to think about, inheritance and propagation of genes than maybe we are consciously aware of.
Yeah.
Growing up, my dad's, I wouldn't say he's like super old school, but I remember growing up, like one of the messages I got was, if you're going to date someone, meet the parents. Like you can learn a lot by meeting the parents, which on the one hand is really cool. It's like, see how their family is and how they interact, but it has a genetic, inheritance implication. Like if they're kind people, what do you look, are you looking for pathology? No, you might be, but you're mainly looking for good features or what's there. No one talks about this openly these days. I feel like it's a really hot button issue. But if I asked you, for instance, if the guy in prison had 4 kids before he went to prison, does that worry you?
I feel like those kids statistically would need more. Like they, a lot of this research didn't pan out, but as a metaphor, I think it's really still useful is the idea of like dandelions and orchids, that there are, or sunflowers and orchids. Like I do think there are some children who, by virtue of their temperament, brain development, are pretty resilient across a variety of different environments. And then I think there are children who, back to dogs, just like there are dogs that like you can be a lazy dog owner and the dog will still be fine. Or you can have a dog where because of their size and because of their temperament and because of their breeding, they need a skilled and loving owner. And we can think of that very clearly. So like my dog, I got him as a rescue, and we think they were being bred as fighting dogs in Texas. And, you can be like, well, there's a vicious attack dog. He's being bred as a fighting dog, and you found out he's had a litter of puppies. Does that make you feel appalled or like they're bad puppies? Or you're like, no, they need really good homes. We have to find really good homes.
My friend Whitney Cummings will be on her way. She's constantly adopting. They're like rescuing pit bull after pit bull. Like, exactly. I think she subscribes to the idea I don't want to put words in her mouth, but they're like, no bad dogs, just bad owners. Yeah. And there are many sweet, sweet, sweet pit bulls that come from fighting camps. In
many ways, I feel like as soon as we get out of how we relate to each other as humans and we think about this, we can think about dog behavior more objectively than we can about human behavior. And we can think, even if personality and temperament is heritable, and even if the parent did terrible things, the offspring are still not bad puppies. They're puppies that are higher needs puppies, or they're puppies that need a more skillful care. And that's how I also think about this. I don't know about hardwired to pay attention to heritable traits. I do think we are evolved to matter to each other in a way that we call moral. I think that we are a social species that evolved to cooperate. And at every point in our evolutionary history, every cooperative system has some mechanism of enforcement. If you have bacteria, colonies of bacteria, and one bacterium starts to soak up too much of the iron or some mineral in the environment that they all need, the others will send out signals to try to hurt that one. And they're like, don't stop doing that. Stop freeloading. Stop taking too much. If we go all the way back to the beginning of our evolutionary history, we have cooperation and enforcement of failures to cooperate. And I think that evolutionary history is a big part of why we feel so intensely when someone harms one another. So Sapolsky can make all his arguments that like we're not supposed to feel moral outrage at people. And for me, I'm like, that's like telling me that everyone should be abstinent. Like, it's just, I think that mattering to each other in the way we call moral is as deeply baked into the sauce of what it is to be human as sexuality is. And so, of course, we get caught in this, what philosophers call this rescue blame trap, which is they did a horrible thing. We think of humans as having agency. Of course, they're to blame for it. They deserve to be punished. Oh, but wait, his genes, his brain, his trauma, his childhood environment. He was also a victim here. Maybe he needs to be rescued from blame. Oh, but he did it. And like, he was so bad. And we go back and forth. We go back and forth about ourselves, right? Like if you've ever done something that you really regret, you have probably done this where you're like, here's all the reasons and I was trying and these were my good intentions, but I can't believe, and how do we find our way through the rescue blame trap? And for me, it was thinking about bad luck doesn't negate responsibility. It might not have been my fault, but it's still my responsibility. But holding people accountable doesn't have to mean harsh punishment. That the accountability doesn't mean making someone suffer. And keeping both of those in the same mind is really what made me feel like I could push through this rescue blame trap. I'm letting that sink in. Everything you say resonates, and I therefore am updating my hypothesis. Again, just a hypothesis that people have an inherent desire to stop the progression of the bad seed. I'm intentionally using this language. Like we want to, like if that person is, sure, stuff happened to them, but guess what? Stuff happened to them because their parents were bad. And guess what? They're bad because their parents were bad. And like, they're a bad seed at the extremes, of course. I also think, because based on your dog example of adopting puppies from, fighting parents, that in that example, there is this notion that with the appropriate amount of love and care that we can rescue them, but also we can choose whether or not they have puppies. Yeah. So I do think that there is this idea that like, if we see children in really horrible circumstances, that I think it's a very human, hardwired thing that we can rescue the lineage. Yeah, that we can rescue lineage. I mean, one thing that's always fascinated me and encouraged me is I think, yes, there's lots of
transgenerational trauma, whether or not it's purely through genes or through experience is still debated, but probably both. But that also in a single generation, that the child of severe alcoholics who makes the choice not to drink or to quit drinking, to then pair with somebody who can have a healthy relationship to alcohol.
They're cycle breakers.
They're cycle breakers. So I think we understand this without understanding genetics.
Yeah.
Like we don't have to take a class and understand Mendelian genetics, to understand that in one generation, something can start or stop in a family line.
Yeah.
And I think most people are wise to the idea that family lines no longer exist in small tribes. I mean, you see shows like Succession, right? Where it's over like, oh, let's talk about the propagation of sociopathic-ish narcissistic traits.
They were not trying to be cycle breakers.
No, they were trying to maintain the cycle that had fed them in their niche.
I mean, I think the other thing with regards to cycle breakers